Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Developer Zone. Today is the 18th of February 2021. So every week we do a webinar only for our ZP Developer Zone members. Just making sure that we've got volume, but yeah, we definitely have volume. Okay. So I will go straight on with the agenda because I've got quite a few slides this morning. So let me just go on with the agenda for this morning. So we'll very lightly touch on Developer Zone. We will touch on electrochemical impedance spectroscopy because we're really dealing with, we've had a bit of a theme for a couple of weeks about candidas. So I want to just touch upon candidas and in the context of electrochemical impedance spectroscopy. Cool. And then we'll do the main technical section. So the pathogen that we're interested in recently has been this candidus fungal infection, which is caused by a yeast. So that's what we are going to focus upon. Obviously this week, not this week, but today we're doing our webinar. Every week we do the webinar. I think we're one of the few groups or memberships that actually does a webinar every week. I am going to finish off this ZP Developer Zone website. And we're also going to put some more content on the ZP Academy, probably about impedance spectroscopy. I've had a look at the ZP Academy. We've got something like 100 students on the ZP Academy these days. But I think we need to add some content about impedance spectroscopy, so I'll be doing that as well. Now, Candida albicans. There was a paper that I brought up last week, and it's a good paper in terms of, you know, the authors and the publishers have allowed this to be downloadable. Cool, there he is here. So, you know, it's nice that we can actually get at the paper. Now, the reason that the theme for this week is actually going to be impedance spectroscopy. And the reason that the theme is going to be impedance spectroscopy is because I touched upon it last week, but in this paper, they make an antibody-based sensor for Candida albicans. And effectively, what happens is they start off with a gold electrode. So they get what's called a Nyquist plot, and we will discuss what a Nyquist plot is in a minute. We have discussed them in the past, but they get a Nyquist plot, which is this black line. So it sort of tells us that this gold electrode, it doesn't have what we call a high resistance or high capacitance. It's gold, so it can pass electricity quite easily. When they put the antibody onto the surface, they get this red line. And what that tells you is that they've now blocked the surface with the antibody. So when you've got pristine gold, you had a nice sort of black curve like this. When they put the antibody onto it, they had the red curve because they've slightly blocked the surface. And then as they add in the pathogen at 10 CFUs, that's 10 colony-forming units per milliliter, 100 CFUs and 1,000 CFUs, you can see that this circle increases and increases. And the reason for that is most likely that there's an element, and this here is called the equivalence circuit. So what it's doing is it's saying as the pathogen binds, the RCT, the charge transfer resistance, increases. And this is fair enough because you're effectively blocking the surface, and you're blocking the surface with the pathogen. So this week I was going to talk about, and I am going to talk about impedance spectroscopy. Oh, this is very cool. Asim just said, hot information. I feel that INNE have recently tested the antibody and 3 peptides of Candida with gold SPE, and the results were very promising. He used differential pulse voltammetry. I'm laughing because obviously I'm looking at the live streaming and I'm talking about electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, and he's used differential pulse voltammetry, but there you go. That's pretty cool. All right. I am going to talk about impedance spectroscopy this week. But impedance spectroscopy, see, is with differential. We'll touch on differential pulse voltammetry. Differential pulse voltammetry and impedance spectroscopy, they're two methods, but they can end up telling you a similar story. Because in the end, the guys are probably blocking the surface and they're changing the resistance of the surface. And they can either detect that blocking by using cyclovoltammetry, differential pulse voltammetry, square wave voltammetry, or maybe impedance spectroscopy. So there's lots of ways of still finding the same phenomena, or the same phenomena. So let me go on a little bit now and say that in order to do this work, you need something like an anapot EIS. So it might be that Hasim correctly, he has some anapots. The anapot is capable of doing what we sort of call DC techniques, direct current techniques. So he will be able to do, in Indonesia, they'll be able to do square wave voltammetry and cyclovoltammetry and chronoamperometry and potentiometry. But they might, and he does, I know that Hasim in Indonesia has a couple of EIS units with clients as well. But the EIS unit allows us to do AC techniques. Now, the reason I want to do this is, when people talk about impedance spectroscopy, they really lose sight of what's important. And it's the same for any technique, like differential pulse voltammetry. People lose sight of what's important. What's important is that we're trying to detect some biology and give people information. So in the case of Candida albicans, we're trying to measure it and give people information about it. And obviously, I've spoken about this in the past, but sometimes people get too obsessed. They get too obsessed with let's say, the mathematics of impedance spectroscopy, and they're losing sight of what they're really here to do is to make a measurement on biology, because ultimately they can help save lives. And so I want to kind of say, look, with electrochemical biosensors, we're measuring biology and we use different techniques, but what's really important is that in the end we get some information out that's useful to people. I'm just reading, because we're live streaming, I'm just reading Hasim's comments that use an anapot and a gold SPE, which is good. He's used a gold value SPE from Zimmer and Peacock, which is this guy in the middle, which is good news, actually, because we do talk about, these techniques, and it's nice that you guys go in the lab, and sort of prove it. Now, impedance spectroscopy fits into the, what's really powerful about electrochemistry is there's so many methods available to us. We talk about voltammetry, and Hasim in the Slack, sorry, not in the Slack, but in the YouTube chat is talking about differential pulse voltammetry. So we can use things like differential pulse voltammetry, amperometry, potentiometry. We don't talk too much about impedance spectroscopy because from a maths perspective, it's probably the most complicated technique, but it is also quite a powerful technique. So we are going to talk about impedance spectroscopy this week. This is what I like about electrochemistry and including impedance spectroscopy, that, you can have literally your laptop, the instrument, and maybe then what we call the device under test, the electrode maybe here in this holder. And within that little footprint, you've got everything you need to do your experiment. So that's really what's elegant about this as a science. Why is impedance spectroscopy confusing to so many people? If you're interested in biosensing, you've got to be very careful, because a lot of impedance spectroscopy is taught from the perspective of people who are making batteries. So companies like Tesla, they're very interested in the impedance spectroscopy of batteries. There's many companies out there making capacitors. There's many people in the world very interested in corrosion and coatings. And then there's people, like ZP and like yourselves who are interested in biosensing. the thing is that most of impedance spectroscopy is kind of taught from these other perspectives. They're not talking or using examples that are particularly meaningful to basically us biosensor guys. So you've got to be a little bit careful when you read the literature about impedance spectroscopy. And the other reason you've got to be careful about reading the literature on impedance spectroscopy, there's so much maths in it. And the maths is not hard, but people start with the maths. And, you really should start with me, for me, you should start with the application and then learn the maths as you go along so that maybe you can understand your data a bit better. But try to understand the maths up front. I don't think it's particularly hard, but I think it's better to start doing. I mean, let's look at Hasim and Annie's as an example. Now Hasim is, is an expert on electrochemical spectroscopy, on electrochemistry. But I suspect he started most of his experience by doing rather than just learning it. Unfortunately, you probably have to be careful with impedance spectroscopy. People will try and, the literature is full of the maths, the books are full of the maths, but the people are not really focused on the application of biosensors. So I'm going to use this slide twice in this, but I think that there's people who try to teach it by maths, and I think that it's better to do experiments. What we do, experiments, model, and fit. So I'll do some what's called modeling as part of this webinar this morning. I just want to sort of say, look, when you're looking at your data in impedance spectroscopy, we often show these curves, this semicircle like this, and it sometimes has a tail like this. Now that might look very confusing, but if you look at absorption spectroscopy, which people are more used to, in absorption spectroscopy, you change the light frequency and the molecules absorb at different frequencies or different wavelengths. So, that we all understand. It's the same really with impedance spectroscopy. We change the frequency and the way the biosensor responds depends on the frequency. So in absorption spectroscopy, the way the sample responds depends on the wavelength or the frequency of light. And it's the same in impedance spectroscopy. The way the sensor responds depends on the frequency. So in impedance spectroscopy, we have a sort of often a semicircle with a tail on it. And that's a reflection of the biosensor under test. Now, people like to look at their data either in the Nyquist plot or the Bode plot. It's just ways of looking at the data. Today, we're just going to cover on the Nyquist plot. Now, the relevance of impedance spectroscopy is because, for example, Hasim and Annie, what they've been doing is they've been taking the gold 303 electrode, they've been putting an antibody on the surface, and they've been binding, in their case, with proteins, and they've been getting some nice, signals. So the relevance is, that impedance spectroscopy, or in their case of using differential pulse voltammetry, is a way of measuring, whether your pathogen or your analyte of interest is interacting with the antibodies that you've immobilized on the gold. So here I've shown a gold electrode, we've immobilized an antibody on the surface, and then the pathogen binds to the surface, and that's the source of the signal. So we take the gold electrode, we functionalize it into a biosensor, and then we can add the pathogen of interest. And as I say, with impedance spectroscopy, we are changing the frequency of, let's say, the electricity in the experiment. In absorption spectroscopy, we change the frequency or the wavelength of light. And that's quite well accepted by people, but people then get a little bit concerned about electrochemistry or impedance spectroscopy because it's so, because people dive so quickly into the maths. I mean, when you do an absorption spectroscopy experiment, how often do we go and do the mathematics straight away? I think we don't. We just record our spectrum and we're generally quite happy with it. But impedance spectroscopy, people seem to think it's very important very quickly to start diving into the maths. And I think you should just just spend time learning the maths, but you can still get on with the experiments. So what the guys will have done in Indonesia, that's Hasim and Eni, what they've done is they've taken their gold electrodes and they've functionalized the antibody onto the surface, and then they've detected it with pathogen. Now, what's happening is there's what's called an equivalent circuit. An equivalent circuit is an electronic model of what the sensor's doing. So they had an electrode and they had another electrode. And they're basically measuring what's happening between these two electrodes. Now, if I was to make a circuit for this sensor, we would have a resistor at the surface, we'd have a capacitor at the surface, and we'd have a resistor between the two electrodes. And so it has a equivalent circuit. We call it the Randall circuit. I just say, you can Google a Randall circuit. It's fairly well known in electrochemistry, but it's just a model for how lots of biosensors actually work, that they have a resistor due to the solution. So when I say solution, that's the buffer, let's say. It has a resistance due to you're trying to transfer electrons across this surface, but you can't because it's partially blocked. And how much you block it changes the resistance. But because you've got proteins and antibodies are really what they have the ability to be capacitors. A capacitor means that I can separate charge. I can have a positive side and a negative side. So proteins and antibodies, they have what we call capacitance properties. They really have insulator properties. They're not inherently very electrically conducting. They're insulators. If you take a protein and cover a metal with it, the metal will become quite insulated. So that's why when you make an equivalent circuit for a biosensor, you have the solution resistance, which is really the resistance of your buffer. If you don't use many salts, your buffer resistance will go up. And if you use lots of salt, then your buffer resistance will go down. If it's easy to oxidize or reduce molecules across your biosensor, then your charge transfer will be small. And as you increase the amount of proteins and antibodies on your surface, your capacitance will go up. So this is an equivalent circuit for a biosensor. Now, in the Nyquist plot, why do we get this, I'm going to call it this funny semicircle and this tail? Why do we get this? And the reason we get this is because you're changing the frequency in this experiment. So when we're at high frequency, it's 50,000 kilohertz, which is basically 50,000 oscillations. We're applying an oscillating voltage. If we apply it 50,000 times in a second, then we will get a resistance found here in the Nyquist plot that's only the resistance of your electrolyte. And as the resistance decreases, let's say electricity now goes through two paths. It either goes through this path of the circuit or this path of the circuit. So we go from a single path, which is here, through two paths. The electricity has two choices to go. And then when we get to very low frequency, it only has one path to go through, which is this side. So why do we have a semicircle? And the reason we have a semicircle is because at high frequency, we go through one path. At medium frequency, we go through two paths, and at low frequency, we only go through one path. We've got a changing system, and it changes, and then we get this tail at the very low frequencies. And this tail is due to diffusion. That's what you're going at this point. You're actually witnessing molecules diffusing to the surface. Now, let me show you some examples now. So a bit like Eni and Hasim, this is work that we did. You took a gold electrode and we put a single-strand DNA capture probe on it, and we then used it to capture another single strand of DNA. And so what happened there was, as we increased the DNA concentration, we went from one semicircle to a bigger semicircle to a bigger semicircle. What was happening was the more DNA we put in there and the more binding we got, the bigger this RCT value became, the bigger the charge transfer resistance became. And so we had a charge transfer resistance that changed as a function of DNA concentration. So in the case of Eni and Hassim, they would have actually been probably looking at the charge transfer resistance, but they would be using a technique called differential pulse voltammetry. But in the end, they're looking at this. It's a different. We're contrasting that you can look at the charge transfer resistance using electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, or you can look at it using maybe differential pulse voltammetry. Now, there's some software that you can download. After this, when I put this video on YouTube, after we've all gone through it, I'll put a link to the software. But what I want to do is I'm going to create you some equivalent circuits. So let me just pull on this software. Now, what this is here is, I'm just going to check that it's going to be large enough. This is a circuit where we've just got one resistor and one resistor. So this is a very boring circuit in some way. So when you've got two resistors like that, and they've both got a resistance of 1,000 ohms, 1,000 plus 1,000 equals 2,000. So we actually have a resistor. So if we have a simple circuit like that, we just have a single plot like that. I'll just simulate it, and we get, if we did impedance spectroscopy on this, we would just show that we had a resistance of 2,000 ohms. The reason I'm showing you this is because people want to teach you the maths of impedance spectroscopy. But I would rather say, rather than teach you the maths of impedance spectroscopy, let's just learn impedance spectroscopy by playing a computer game. And so let me take so what I could do is I can, this software is available for download, and I'll put a link down below. But let me just take a simple circuit out of the library. It's a resistor plus a capacitor. And let me just run a simulation on it. What you get is a straight line straight up. And what's happening here is, this is a Nyquist plot. So it's saying to us, if I look along here, it's saying to me, you have a resistor that's 1,000 ohms. Yeah, that's correct. And then as the frequency changes, you have a capacitor, and that's why we have a straight line up. If we change that back to a resistor, just watch the way it changes. We have a single dot. Now let's add in a capacitor again. Now we get a line. What I want to now do is I'm going to add a parallel. I'm going to add a resistor in with it. So now this is the Randall circuit: resistor, and then a capacitor and a resistor in parallel with each other. There we are. We get that nice semicircle. Now, in the work of Eni and Hassim, I suspect what was happening was, as they bound more proteins to their antibody, they were increasing this resistance. So if they were doing EIS, they would have noticed that their semicircle went from originally they would have been at something like, I'm just making this up at the moment. They were originally been at 2,000 ohms here, and then if they just let's say double that to 2,000, they went to 3,000 ohms. Because what this semicircle tells you is, here, this is R1. This is your buffer resistance, and the difference between here and here is your charge transfer resistance, your RCT. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add in an element. Add an element. It's called the whoops-a-daisy. Oh well, it's okay. And see, whoops. I'm going to add in the resistor. Yeah, this is just, right. So what I've done now is I've created another circuit where it's the resistance of the buffer, the capacitance of the biosensor, the charge transfer of the biosensor, and because we've got stuff like ferrocyanide in solution, we have a Warburg element. This is a diffusion element. This is talking about molecules that are diffusing in and out of the electrodes. Let's simulate that. And I'll just change this down to about, oops. And now we get a Nyquist plot that's kind of quite classical. It says that what this Nyquist plot says to us is, if you get data like this, it tells us that the resistance of your buffer was about 1,000 ohms. The charge transfer resistance was about 1,000 ohms. Is it 1,000 to 2,000? That's a difference of 1,000. And then this tail here tells us that we had a diffusional process, which is probably linked to the ferrocyanide. Now, what this says to you is this. If you do impedance spectroscopy and you want to understand why does my spectrum look the way it does, you can just teach yourself in some ways by just doing this kind of game where you just play with the software and effectively try out different things. I don't want to get too crazy on this, but if I add I don't think this will necessarily make a lot of difference, but in series a Warburg here. This is a bit silly, but it completely changed it by just doing that. Now, if I make that, it actually looks very similar to the other one. So you can see that, in fact, you can end up with lots of equivalent circuits that all give you pretty similar looking data. So your equivalent circuits have to be sensible, but you can see there that because I suppose in some ways, most of this semicircle is actually governed by the C1 and the R2, and the W1 and the W2 only show up in this part. That's why it doesn't actually affect the data too much. So I would say, yeah, the webinar is almost finished, so we need to use, Hasima's just giving me a little hint that we need to finish up pretty quickly, so I am going to finish up pretty quickly. So let me summarize this. I love impedance spectroscopy. It is actually quite interesting, but don't get obsessed with the maths and theory. Download the software, play with doing modeling, so you can teach yourself through modeling rather than just the maths and theory. You can look at the maths and theory afterwards, but I would say do modeling first. This is our own experience recently where we've been doing EIS spectroscopy. And what we discovered was that, in fact, our signal was not in the charge transfer resistance. It was in the capacitance. So I've run out of time this morning, so I'm going to, because we were coming up to the hour. But I just want to say that at Zimmer and Peacock, we do what we preach, which is this is our own data and this is our own fitting. I'm going to skip through it. And what I'm going to do now, I'm actually just going to do a quick summary of this week. So I'm glad that Annie and Hasima are actually doing some work in the lab. I am interested in what you guys are doing. You're doing differential pulse voltammetry. Impedance spectroscopy is also another way of doing this. But don't get obsessed too much with the maths. I would almost just do the experiments and later on, learn the maths as you try to understand your experiments rather than try to do the maths and then do the experiments. All right, so we've come up to the half the hour. I'm going to say thank you very much. I can see that Hasim is telling people to get on the Discord server. I'll do the same. I'll post this video shortly, and then I'll also put some links to some of the software that I think you need to download. All right, thanks, Hasim and Annie, for getting in the lab. That's really good news, and hopefully speak to you guys soon. All right, I'll be in Discord shortly. All right, take care.